Right. Should we get started? Yeah. All right, lovely. Well, welcome everybody. I actually can't see who's on the screen, so I do apologise. My name's Hayley. I'm from Darwin Community Legal Service. I'll be running this session today on older persons abuse. If you have any questions throughout any of this, just feel free to pop them in the chat message or raise your hand. And Sarah here will just let me know and we can try and answer them either at the time or towards the end of the session. So yeah, we'll just go get started. So to begin with, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and I'd also like to extend that respect to First Nations people joining us here today. Okay, so to begin with, I mean, I'm sure a lot of you are probably aware of our organisation, but I'll just give you a brief overview. So we're the Darwin Community Legal Service. We're a not-for-profit community-based organisation where we're committed to legal and social justice and the protection and expansion of rights, fairness and wellbeing in the Northern Territory. Within DCLS, we have three main divisions, which is our general legal service. We also have a tenancy advice service and then our senior and disability rights service, which is the team that I work in. So our general legal service, they provide basically general legal service to anyone in the Northern Territory. So it's usually civil matters and it's more or less just an introduction to through the volunteer advice service. That's more or less an introduction to our general legal service. So yeah, we have with things such as debt, Centrelink. We also do guardianship, which is a big thing that comes up in our tenancy advice service. That's focused on people renting in the Northern Territory. So whether that's public housing or private housing, we can generally help. And then within our seniors and disability rights service, we have the aged care team, and then we also have the disability team. So that's things like NDIS appeals. We go through that whole process. Getting access to NDIS, disability support pension, and then also with our seniors rights service, we do things like age pension, issues with the service provider that aged people are with, getting access to services, those types of things. So pretty broad, the work that we do. And yeah, generally, if you're someone who's living with a disability or a carer or a representative, we can generally help you. And then if you're a senior, it's if you're over the age of 65 or 50 if you're Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander. We do lots of education sessions. So a lot of our work is going out to communities, going out to remote areas, rural areas, and providing education and empowerment work. Just about our services and the way that we can help people. We have Ramnick. I'm not sure if anyone's met Ramnick, but he's our community education team worker. So he goes out to lots of different institutions and yeah, provides education to staff just about how they can help their team and residents as well. That's yeah, basically what I've just touched on with our seniors and disability rights service. So that we mainly deal with older persons abuse, which we'll talk about today. So generally, if you do have any inquiries about older persons abuse or you need information, it would be someone within our team that'd be able to help you. Yeah, like I said, we go out to urban and remote settings. So we service the top end for seniors disability rights. So where that's anywhere from CAPA and upwards generally, and then Catholic care, they're basically the bottom end. So they'd be the aged care advocate organisation that you contact if you needed support. Okay. So in today's session, we're mainly going to be talking about the older persons abuse toolkit. This was launched in on the 15th of June this year, which was the World Elder Abuse Awareness Day. I'm not sure whether anyone is familiar with our toolkit, but we're going to basically go through the whole thing in this session today. Basically, it's used as a guide. It's not like it's used as a resource, not necessarily like a definitive response. So it's an awesome toolkit. We do have it all electronic as well. So after today's session, we'll send it out to everyone. And then, yeah, if you have other people that need it as well, we can pass it on to them as well. So yeah, today's session, we're going to focus on this. We'll talk about the different types of older person's abuse, some of the risk factors for people who might experience older person's abuse, and then finally some of the steps that we can put in place to respond to abuse for older people as well. Okay, so the background to the toolkit. So in 2019, we received funding from the Department of Territory, Families, Housing and Communities. And basically that was used to establish the older person strategic advocacy project. So that project was then used to inform change, policy development and service delivery while building on the learnings and networks from previous projects that the Seniors and Disability Rights team had completed. So the project was aimed at raising community awareness. It provides support and information for older person experiencing abuse, and then it encourages local responses to the problem. So it's a direct reflection on the national plan to respond to the abuse of older persons, and like with the main initiatives being enhancing our understanding, improving community awareness and access to information, and then planning for future decision making. So part of that funding was used to establish this toolkit. So this has been in the works for quite some time. It's a really great resource. It includes information like on the elder person's abuse. It's got lots of resources here in the Northern Territory for organisations that can assist. And this was like I said, launched on the 15th of June this year. So if you also want a physical copy, we can pass that out to your staff and stuff as well. So I guess the reason why the toolkit was brought in was that, as you might all be aware, older person abuse is increasingly prevalent and prominent issue. There's definitely high rates in community and institutional settings such as nursing homes and aged care facilities. One of the issues that we find is while we all are aware that older abuse is happening and it's very prevalent, there's a lot of solutions as such, or there's not easy solutions. So while we're aware of it, like it's often underreported, or it might be not the person who's being abused, it might be someone else that's like letting us know that this is happening, and it can be quite difficult to actually take action. One survey that our organisation conducted in 2020 found that 72% of older person abuse victims were women, with 62% of those Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander background. And then in 75% of these cases, the abuser was a family member. Financial abuse is definitely the most common that we see, particularly out in community as well. Funding just seems to be the common theme wherever you go, but it can be quite difficult to manage. Like we can put strategies in place, but often it can be very difficult to try and manage that whole abuse. Another part of the funding that we received, we established the Older Persons Information Line. So there's the national hotline, which isn't this. So people can call a national hotline for older persons abuse, and it goes to territory bases. Whereas this one here is our DCLS hotline. So from 9 till 5, Monday to Friday, anyone can call. And basically it's designed to be an information source. So people call seeking initial advice, whether they might be reporting that there's someone they know is experiencing financial abuse, what can they do? Or there's an assault that's happened in the aged care facility or whatever it is. We generally just point people in the right direction. If we can assist, we would refer to our legal team or take them on as a client. But yeah, generally it's just mainly like an information initial point, and then when we make referrals from there. So I guess one of the main things to note with older persons abuse is the rights of older people. I think a lot of the time older people are reluctant to report abuse because they don't understand their rights. They don't understand that they do have certain rights, and that these kind of things that are happening maybe in a residential aged care facility shouldn't actually be happening because they're not aware. So in 2019, the Charter of Aged Care Rights, which is on here, was established, which I'm sure perhaps most of you might have seen. But basically it's anyone that's accessing aged care services, they have those rights that are listed on there. So safe and high quality care and services, treated, hi, how you going? To be treated with dignity and respect, have their identity, culture and diversity valued and supported, live without abuse and neglect, informed about their care and services in a way that they understand. They can access all information about themselves, including information about their rights, care and services, their independence, being listened to, like I'm sure you can read it from there. So a lot of the time, yeah, people are unaware that they have these rights, and that's why they can often fall victim to abuse. On the left here, independence, participation, care, self-fulfillment and dignity, they're all rights that were established by the United Nations as well. That was back in the 90s. So I think when people aren't aware that they have all these rights, then yeah, they can fall victim to certain types of abuse. So I guess what is older persons abuse? Sorry, 1 second. So the World Health Organization defines elder abuse as a single repeated act or lack of appropriate action occurring within any relationship where there is an expectation of trust, which causes distress to an older person. So more often than not, you do find that people who are experiencing older person abuse, it's by someone that they know. So whether it's a family member or someone within the aged care or residential aged care where they're staying. I think older persons abuse is quite prevalent because they're particularly vulnerable. A lot of the time they're dependent on someone caring for them, and they fear that if they speak up, then they're not going to be, like, they'll lose their services, they won't be able to receive care anymore. And there's that dependency. So with that, yeah, they can often fall victim to this kind of abuse. So does anyone know any of the different types of abuse? I mean, it's quite, there's lots of different types, but can anyone think of any that they'd like to share? Not happy to carry on.
Emotional.
Yeah, emotional, definitely. Yeah.
Financial.
Yeah. Physical, yeah. Yeah, yeah, amazing. Yeah, so they're all correct. So we'll go through each of them just in a little bit of detail. So physical abuse, including sexual abuse, so deliberately causing physical pain or injury, physical restraint, that kind of all falls under that physical abuse. Then there's sexual abuse is any unwanted sexual behavior from another person, including sexually offensive language, harassment, indecent assault and rape. It sounds pretty confronting, but the sexual abuse in residential aged care facilities is actually quite high. OPEN reported that it's estimated, I think, there's 50 cases of sexual abuse in residential aged care reported per week across Australia, which is quite concerning. But we can chat about that just a bit later. So some of the signs for recognizing abuse. So these are just some potential signs. So torn or bloody underclothing or bedding, unexplained or unattended injuries or conditions, unexplained STD or incontinence, internal injuries, bruising or bleeding, discrepancies between an injury and the explanation of how it happened, injuries at different stages of healing. So particularly in aged care facilities or in instances where people are going out to homes providing care, if the person's vulnerable, like it's quite difficult for them to report it. They don't feel confident to be able to report it. So I guess it's important to note that if you do recognize any of these signs and people aren't saying anything, then it's always best to report it. Another form, psychological or emotional abuse. This one is also quite common. So inflicting mental anguish on an older person, creating fear or feelings of shame and powerlessness. Psychological abuse often occurs through insults, threats, humiliation, controlling behavior, confinement, and isolation. So again, this is something that we also see come through to our organisation. So we often have clients who their daughter or their son is threatening to self-harm if the parent doesn't do something. So there's a lot of emotional abuse that comes through there, or there's threats that they can't see their grandchildren or certain things like that as well. And a lot of the time people aren't aware that they're being emotionally abused. They can't make that connection. They just think that their child is being cruel, but really it's a form of psychological abuse. Again, these are some of the signs that you might be able to recognize with someone who might be experiencing a form of psychological or emotional abuse. And one of the third main ones is neglect or abandonment. So withholding essential care of an older person, including withholding food, accommodation, clothing, medical care, or emotional support. So and a few other signs of this are injuries that haven't been treated properly, lack of safety or inappropriate supervision, abandonment, lack of social, cultural, intellectual, or physical stimulation, malnutrition and weight loss, complaints of being too cold or too hot, and poor personal hygiene. This one can be quite common, particularly in residential aged care facilities. More so, I think, unintentionally, like when there's staffing issues, people might not be seen as often as they should be. Certain people might be needed to be returned every so often because of their condition and they're not. So that can also come as under a form of abandonment. Again, it's quite tricky because obviously there's staffing issues, but we do get some referrals for that kind of thing as well. Financial exploitation. So this is the main form of elder person's abuse that we see. Improper use of an older person's money or assets, including withholding money or making decisions on how their money is used without their consent. So there's some more signs there with some belongings or assets, not being able to access food, clothing, shelter, or utilities. That can be quite common, particularly out in community where people aren't able to pay for their foods due to outlugging. Unusual bank account activity, not being able to access bank statements. Lots of different examples of financial abuse that we see. Social abuse, that's another main one, which is isolating an older person from their friends, family, and community, restricting or preventing them from social contact with others, and denying or limiting their social activities. So some potential signs are changes in their self-esteem, sadness or grief at the loss of important relationships, suspected abuse and making decisions on behalf of the older person where they could generally do it for themselves. And then finally, cultural and spiritual abuse. So being denied your culture, your worldview, your identity, and your cultural obligations. So not allowing you to speak in your primary language, not being allowed to attend your church, not being allowed to observe religious holidays. There's some of the signs of potential abuse as well. So an example of one client that we had, so this person was living in a residential aged care facility. The family had lodged an application for adult guardianship, saying that the person lacked legal capacity, because they would often make jokes and they were quite sarcastic. So the family deemed that they didn't have capacity to make any of their own decisions. The older person disagreed with this as well, and then got in touch with our organisation. So we accompanied them to go get a memory test, like go get a cognitive assessment, and it proved that they had full capacity. So then as a result of that, the guardianship order was cancelled. But the main reason that the guardianship order wanted to be, this was like a son that was trying to do it, and he wanted to have financial control. This gentleman had quite a few assets and everything as well. So since then, this was a case study from a couple of years ago, I think, or last year, and the person is still got cognitive capacity, able to make all of their own decisions, able to be in control of their care. So I think it can be quite important for older people, particularly people just assume that because they're a certain age, or they might get confused about certain things, that they don't have the cognitive capacity to make decisions. And then when you go under guardianship, you give up so much of your freedom. So I think it's important to just, if you suspect that someone is in a situation where they might not be, they might be taken advantage of, then to always reach out to an organisation like us, and we can always investigate. So going back to the sexual assault that I was talking about earlier. So like I said, it's about 50 cases are reported each week across Australia. So OPAN, which is the Older Persons Advocacy Network, which is part of our funding body as well, they launched in 2021 the Ready to Listen project. So basically the whole idea of the project is to build on the skills and capacity of staff at the aged care service providers to be able to better to respond and prevent sexual assault in residential aged care. So it's focused around this MAP elements that you see here. So that's myths, facts, and practical strategies. And basically it's a series, it's like a module that's available to staff, and yeah, a series of webinars that go through all the topics that are listed there. It's a really great resource to help empower staff to recognize when someone's in a situation where they've been sexually assaulted, and then the steps that they can do to try and prevent that from occurring again. Does anyone have any questions so far before I keep talking?
I just had a question about the sexual assault reports. Do you find that most of them are, do you know, most of them are sort of like carer to old person based, or whether it's also an issue of, you know, people within a residential care facility?
I'm not sure, but I can find out for you. It wasn't, yeah, I don't actually know what the number is, but I'm sure it would be a bit of work, but I can, yeah, definitely find out for you. Now, an example of financial elder abuse. I'm not sure if anyone's aware of this report, the No More Humbug, Reducing Aboriginal Financial Elder Abuse in the Kimberley. It's a really interesting report that talks about financial abuse in the Kimberley communities. So it was produced by Kimberley Birds as part of the Kimberley Community Legal Services Aboriginal Financial Elder Abuse Project. Basically, it was a 6-month project where they conducted interviews, did survey work across different communities. And some of the key findings that I've listed here: financial abuse obviously is widespread in the Kimberley, which I guess would be the same to said here in the Northern Territory. Aboriginal elders can bear financial burden for extended family. Banks, retailers, and government agencies can enable abuse. This one I thought was particularly interesting because it discussed centre pay and how there's no like the screening and monitoring process isn't that great. So a lot of businesses can set up centre pay, and then as a result of that, they can be like older people can fall victim to abuse through that. Another thing with banks, they found that in certain areas, people would hold their bank cards, like an older person's bank cards, or not give them cash. I think the whole idea was that they were trying to help them, but then by doing that, you're taking away their freedom as well. So yeah, it was quite interesting because a lot of the methods that we can suggest to help prevent financial abuse, such as setting up centre pay payments, and rather than receiving your payments in a lump sum, you can get $50 each day. Like you're trying to do the right thing, but then in another way that you can also be abused through that as well. Cultural factors specific to communities mean patterns of financial abuse are different to urban settings. This was also quite interesting because it spoke about how there can be cultural obligations within certain communities to provide money, food, clothing, whatever, to people younger than them. So how certain people might view financial abuse is different how in certain communities as well. And then finally, the culturally appropriate solution should be designed for financial elder abuse in remote Aboriginal communities. So that was based on all the surveys and the interviews. That was also quite common, where they were saying that the solutions that you put in place in urban settings need to be different to communities, and they should involve elders as well. So it's a really interesting article, this one here, and while it's based in the Kimberley, a lot of the findings you can relate to the Northern Territory and why there is such difficulty reporting financial abuse and responding to financial abuse, because a lot of the time people aren't aware that they're being financially abused. They don't have the understanding of what financial abuse is. And then there's also, it can be quite complicated because there's also threats of self-harm, violence, certain things as well, which make financial abuse happen as well. So it can be quite complicated. There's no kind of clear-cut solution to financial abuse, but yeah, the main findings were that to involve the community and making sure that they're involved in any solutions that they try and work up, basically. So these are some of the reasons, I guess, why people don't report older person's abuse. So guilt, shame, damaging family relationships, retaliation, lack of knowledge about available sources of help. That's a big one. So a lot of the work that we do is we provide education and empowerment to the elderly people within the community, so that they are aware and they get them thinking that, okay, maybe the situation that's happening is abuse, and then where they can go for help. Because we all know that things are happening, but a lot of the time they just don't know where to go for it. And if they're in a situation where the abuse is happening in the home, or whether it's at the aged care facility that they're staying at, it can be quite difficult as well. So that's why a lot of people don't report, and then the data that we see is not reflective of what's actually happening as well. So can anyone think of any potential risk factors for someone who might experience or be potential to experience older person's abuse?
Mental condition.
Yeah.
And then with the finance, if they have money or a lot of money.
Yeah. Definitely. Yeah, that's all correct. So environmental or external factors. So we've got things such as family history, ethnicity and culture, language and cultural barriers, lack of information about their rights, social and geographical isolation, care, stress and economic pressures, dependency, including living with the perpetrator. So that is quite common, the dependency one as well. Then we've got personal factors, so disability, poor health, reduced capacity, mental health issues, substance abuse or gambling problems, financial exclusion or gender. These are all factors that can contribute to a person having an increased risk of experiencing any type of older person's abuse. Then the perpetrator factors. So majority of perpetrators are aged 35 to 54 generally, and they usually know the victim as well. Children, partners, relatives, quite common if they're living together. Hostility or negative attitudes. Again, care, stress and economic pressures, and mental health issues as well. So these are all factors that can contribute to a person having an increased risk of experiencing older person's abuse. It's important to note, so cultural considerations, so cultural safety and cultural security are important considerations in responding to older person abuse. This includes awareness of your own cultural background and how that may be influencing your perception and interpretation of what is occurring. With older Aboriginal people, 80% of older Aboriginal people in the Northern Territory live outside of urban areas as well. So another case study we've got here that happened with one of our clients was there was an elderly Aboriginal man undergoing guardianship of the government entity, and they were being treated in a hospital a long way away from their country and community. The man was dying. The hospital could only provide palliative care. There were no aged care or palliative care services in his community, but the man strongly wished to return to his country and community. So the guardian was concerned that the man would not be cared for if this occurred. However, there was no investigations to see whether the man had actually returned to the community. The guardian was basically just making their own decision based on the situation. No steps were being taken to see that the older person could actually have their wishes fulfilled as well. So important to think about. So at the end of the day, people should have control over their own choice and whether they want to be able to be in hospital or where they want to go. So it's just about ensuring that we can facilitate that for them and that people are doing the right thing by the older person. So some of the steps to assessing and responding to the abuse of older persons. So there's lots of steps that you can take, but these are kind of 6 of the main ones that are outlined in the toolkit. So identify whether abuse is taking place. So pretty straightforward. Ask questions, try and identify what's happened, might be talking to other people. Important to note that each workplace might have screening questions to use during an assessment to help identify the signs of older person abuse. So important to familiarize yourself with that within your own organization. Vulnerability of older people to abuse and approaches to prevention involve individual, community and society factors as well. So yeah, important to ask questions and just find out what the best process is. Step 2, listen and value. So just let the older person, if they're willing to, talk about their story. Pretty straightforward, but don't interrupt. Just let them kind of disclose as much as they are willing to share with you. Acknowledge what they're feeling, validate their experiences. Obviously maintain confidentiality as well, unless the person is at risk of harm. So it's important for them, particularly if abuse has happened, that they feel comfortable and safe sharing their story. Assess the risk. So depending on what's happened, determine the level of urgency and safety concerns in order to address or to discover the type of risk. So is it urgent? Do they need emergency response? Call the police, 000, urgent response or non-urgent response, whether it's just reporting it to an organization or whatever it is. You just have to determine the level of risk. Then plan for safety. So take steps to safeguard the older person and others in any response to the abuse. Step 5, document and report. So record your concerns and actions taken in line with your workplace policies and processes. And then refer. So refer the older person to appropriate services, including the level of risk. except for mandatory domestic and family violence reporting obligations, it is only appropriate to contact a service on behalf of an older person without their consent if it's an emergency. So this is where it can be quite tricky. I know within our organisation, we do get a lot of calls from a concerned family member or friend saying, you know, this type of, they're being financially abused, what can they do? Or like, can you help them? But a lot of the time we do need the older person to consent to that, and they need to be the ones that are reporting, unfortunately. So that's where it can also be quite hard to help, because they need to be firstly aware that they're being abused. A lot of the time they're not aware. So we just try and encourage people to encourage the older person to speak out and contact us, the support organisation, to try and help.
Where the older person themselves doesn't have capacity, are you able to accept like instructions basically on behalf of a guardian or family member?
Yeah. So as long as they have a guardianship order in place, or if they don't, then we would go by the older person. Yeah. Or when it's listed as their representative.
About just thinking too, like you talked about, like they're not aware they're being abused. Do you ever encounter a situation where they kind of refuse to accept it or admit it because, you know, it's shameful? Or like, like my dad is really from the school of thought of like, drink a cup of concrete and harden up.
Yeah.
So what he says. So you can't, you know, force someone to do it,
You can't.
but do you still try to sort of encourage them that it, or like, I don't know, counsel them to say it's not shameful to admit? Or,
Yeah, definitely. And that's where it's quite hard, because yeah, like you say, a lot of people, they might be aware, they might not be aware, but they don't want to acknowledge it or do anything about it. So we can't really do too much. Like, we can't force someone to make a report, we can't force them to go and get support, but we can provide them with information about different types of abuse, where they can go if they decide that they do want to do something. So whether they contact us, Relationships Australia, what the support avenues are. But that's where it's quite disheartening sometimes, because even if we're aware of something happening, unless they want to do something about it, we can't. Yeah. Which is hard. So, and that's what we have, like a lot of our referrals are concerned people calling on behalf, or calling because they're experiencing or noticing something happening. But a lot of the time it's just we're providing information, but we can't, unless it's a serious offense that's happening, we can't really do too much except just encourage them or make them aware that, hey, this actually might not be okay, and if you do want to do something about it, you can come and talk to us or whatever. But whether that happens or not. So mandatory reporting. So I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with this, but the Domestic and Family Violence Act 2007 defines domestic and family violence as including physical harm, mental harm, property damage, intimidation, stalking, series of different things. So under the Act, all adults in the Northern Territory have a responsibility to make a report to the Northern Territory Police if they reasonably believe that someone has caused or is likely to cause serious physical harm to someone else with whom they're in a domestic relationship, or the life or safety of someone is under serious or imminent threat because domestic violence has been or is being about to be committed. Failing to report is an offence under the Act. So I guess important to know that if you do come across situations where there is a serious offence happening, that we need to report it.
Sorry,
Yeah, that's fine.
in terms of the classification, obviously as a carer, including a paid carer relationship being a domestic relationship under the Act, do you ever find an issue with like making mandatory reports arising where a person is experiencing serious physical harm from somebody where they're like in institutionalized care and they have a paid carer?
To be honest, I'm not super familiar with
Yeah.
but I can follow up for you. But I am not aware of that. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I was just interested because I've like obviously being friends with domestic violence. Legal
Yeah.
service, we deal with military issues
Yeah.
a lot, including carer relationships, but
Yeah.
usually more like family carer relationships where there would be a domestic relationship anyway outside of that carer
Yeah.
definition.
Yeah. I think that's true. Sure. No. So some of the key resources. So the National Elder Abuse Line, that when that number is called, that goes to territory families. But then we have a separate number, which is the one that I mentioned earlier, where that just comes to our organisation. So basically, yeah, the whole idea is just for a one-stop shop, basically for people to call and get information about who can help. So we do a lot of referrals, particularly to Relationships Australia. They're really good with mediation between, a lot of the time, yeah, there needs to be mediation between family members. So they're, yeah, a great resource as well. The Northern Territory Community Directory, so that has got up-to-date information on basically all services in the Northern Territory, including what support they provide. So that's also like a really great resource. OPAN as well, so Older Persons Advocacy Network, they have got heaps of information online, lots of different webinars they do, outlining older persons abuse, the Ready to Listen project as well, which is really interesting. Even like things on residential aged care, how to support people in residential aged care, those kind of things as well. So lots of organisations that we work with to try and prevent older persons abuse. I mean, like I touched on, it's a very complicated thing and it can be quite tricky to help people when they're not willing to make reports for certain things. So we just try and educate people as best as they can, educate staff, empower them to recognise or feel confident they've got the skills to recognise abuse when it's happening, and then have those conversations with people, make referrals, and then hopefully, you know, we'll be able to try and reduce the amount of older abuse, which that's wishful thinking. Does anyone have any questions?
Yes, Serena here from Northern Territory Legal Aid Commission. Can you give an example of a case where somebody has experienced financial abuse and then has reported it? What could be the possible outcome? Is it something that just simply goes to court, or is there some process before that a client can take?
Yeah. So I can't speak from a legal side of things because I'm not a lawyer from a legal background, but depending on the issue, there are steps that we can put in place to try and prevent or minimize the financial abuse. So that might be contacting the bank, putting certain blocks on the bank transactions. We can help them change their bank account details, change their PIN, help them to set up CenterPay so their essential bills and everything is paid for before they receive the rest of their money. So a lot of the time they'll lose all their money and then they can't afford to pay their bills, certain things. We can help them to, with Centrelink, set up certain payments. So yeah, like they receive $50 a day rather than the lump sum of whatever their pension is. So there's some of the preventative things that we can put in place, trying to educate people on like financial literacy and how how they can access their bank accounts. We run sessions online, which I know it's not practical, but for some people, we run sessions online using online bank accounts and certain things so that they can better track those things. So from an advocacy point of view, there are kind of some things that we can put in place. But as for the legal side of things, I'd have to get back to you because I'm just not.
Yeah, I'm more interested in what happens, what recourse a client has that wants to pursue the loss of assets and money.
Yeah, I
When
have
they-
to get,
Yeah, when they recognise that, oh, that was financial abuse.
yeah,
And what can a financial counsellor do to assist a client before referring them out? I
yeah,
think, you know, by the time we see the client, the damage is done.
yeah.
So what we need to know is what we can do and what is possible.
Yeah, no, definitely. And it's a really great question. Like I said, I don't have a legal background, so I can't answer that, but I'll definitely have a chat to our GLS team. Because they'd be able to follow and would be able to answer that.
Yeah, we can get back to you about that. Our general legal service team or principal solicitor can have a bit of a chat to you. We can either talk to you via phone, make a meeting, or we can send you an email with today's topic as well, with all the questions that you've raised today.
I would also be really interested in that from a legal perspective, sort of,
Yeah.
you know, from the point that somebody calls the helpline, for example, comes and says, you know, I'm experiencing physical and emotional and financial abuse. What are the kind of legal remedies that they have in terms
Yeah.
of tackling those things?
Yeah, definitely. We can maybe prepare. If anyone wants to send through maybe any specific questions as well, we can maybe prepare like a fact sheet and then get the solicitors to respond to that. Because yeah, they'll be better equipped to answer those questions than I will. I guess the main form of today was just to discuss our toolkit. Like I said, it was used as a guide. But yeah, those specific questions, we can definitely get the answers for you, not a problem. Was there anything else that any other questions? Yeah.
Unless anybody else wants to jump in. I guess similar to what Serena was saying, but more from the housing perspective. What are some sort of practical things that you would do for someone if they were, say, like living with the perpetrator of financial and physical abuse, let's say it's their son or daughter or something? Yeah, what I guess would be the go-to like practical advice or steps you would take
When they're living with the person. I mean, it's so difficult because it's so complicated. Depending, we can help do housing transfer requests, like urgent ones, perhaps to try and remove them from the situation. Generally, though, when it's quite complicated like this, we do refer to organisations that specialise. We don't specialise in family domestic violence, which your organisation probably would. So
Yeah.
we would generally refer. So while we talk about older persons abuse and we have the hotline, it is just more or less like an information resource, and we generally provide like avenues for people to go down, like refer them to different organisations. But as for housing, yeah, we might transfer, put in an application, but if it's an emergency, then we're not an emergency service as well, so we wouldn't jump in and try to remove them from that situation.
Yeah, I guess like obviously coming from a specialist domestic violence service, we have all organisations that we work with or refer to assist people who are in emergency housing situations. And there's some crossover here, but sometimes those domestic violence services are very overwhelmed.
Yeah.
They might not cater to the specific needs of an elderly person. So I guess I was just wondering whether there were any like go-to other organisations or resources outside of like the domestic violence shelters and things that would be able to use specifically.
So I have a background in domestic violence services, but from my experience, sort of, and that was around a year ago, we were actually taking on, especially as the outreach case management, and a lot more older people as clients, and doing that case work around those situations, helping them to change, bank details, and finances, working with the Department of Housing, potentially having people evicted from their house, or whether it's with police around who's working with international police or an older person. But it is, I think because all the person abuse sometimes isn't seen as being part of that domestic and family violence, but it is certainly something that domestic and family violence services would do case management around. And they would be getting more and more familiar with it now, because it is something that's certainly come on a lot. So referrals to those kind of services would be out of their remit, I guess.
Yeah, I don't, off the top of my head, don't know any organizations, that, yeah, is there any other?
No, I mean, I guess, yeah, all the domestic violence refuges have outreach workers as well, so it doesn't have to be like a refuge case, it could be something where it's just a bit of outreach case management or support. But sort of said to like Department of Housing, and they're all aware of situations like this, and they have different strategies that they put in place that can help with people with it.
So would that be a matter of then referring people to Centrelink department?
So you can, I guess, link people, or if it's because usually if it's our support person that's calling, I think when I like advise them to link that person with the support worker, essentially how payments are done and things like that to limit the possibility of financial abuse. As well.
That's so complicated. Yeah. And I'm not an expert in the area at all, so I don't want to be answering questions I don't know the answer to. Does anyone else have any other questions?
Just one final comment. I really think that the banks, you know, while they pat themselves on the back and think they've come a long way with recognising elder abuse and DV abuse, financial DV abuse, there's a lot more that they can do. And my experience has been a reluctance to accept or admit that they have facilitated the financial abuse, and that is of great concern to me. I've got a case that's before the Ombudsman, and the bank fails to recognise that there has been financial elder abuse, that all the checks that they needed to do were done, and that's it.
Yeah, I actually
Really concerning.
Yeah, it really is. I attended a webinar last week on elder persons abuse, and there was someone there from Westpac, I think, ANZ, but it was interesting because they basically like acknowledged that there is training that they need to do, and the training needs to be the people who are client facing, but you know, they said they have all these checks and things in place, but unless the staff have that training to be able to recognize financial abuse, then they often help facilitate it. So they were kind of just saying that, yeah, they're aware of it and they're trying to put things in place, but it often doesn't happen, or it just, yeah, they kind of enable these things. So yeah, it's quite interesting.
I know that sorry, I was just going to say the Commonwealth Bank have done some really serious retraining and recognising financial abuse with their staff, and also provided financial counsellors nationally with training, believe it or not, which has been really good. But I find the other banks and a lot of organisations, it's just something that they don't believe is their responsibility to recognise. And when it's pointed out and it's there in black and white, they just still refuse to acknowledge that they've facilitated that.
Yeah, it's awful as well. So it's like, what steps can you take from that as well? So hopefully, this person that spoke the other day, she did say that there was, you know, they're trying to do a big push about training their staff and everything, but it's still such a long process as well. So what happens in the interim? Don't know. It's interesting though.
Where I see quite a few cases where it's like the banks have put a hold on people's funds because different family members have said different things.
Yeah,
We need to get the legal service in to try and untangle it all, and it turns out that they, should have taken the steps they did in the first place, but it's hard to.
yeah. It's just so complicated, everything. Did anyone else want to comment on anything? Well, we might leave it there. Let me make sure I've got another. So like we said, we might prepare, get the legal team to prepare just some information on some of those legal questions that were asked, and then we can send them out. We'll also send out the toolkit as well, which, like we said, is a really awesome guide. And if anyone thinks of any kind of specific questions or, after this, then just send us an email and we can answer that for you as well.
Thank you very much.
Lovely.
Thank you. Thanks.
All right, see you later.
Bye.